Hey everybody, this is a rundown of some of the features in Google's new Gemini 3 model. Now they've just rolled out Gemini 3 across its normal Google Gemini platform, so you can see not much has changed in the interface. But down here on the right hand side, where we used to have the Fast and Pro models, we've now got Fast and Thinking. And Thinking is we found the new 3 model. I'm using the paid version of Google Gemini here through my Google Workspace account, and I'll also use AI Studio in a little while. So first of all, just a really simple fetch and carry kind of task. Browse online for some open access journal articles suitable for a literature student. And all I'm really trying to do here is see whether Google Gemini 3 is any good at fetching some slightly more complex than usual search results. So it goes into its thinking mode. It gets a bit excited there. It says it's hit the jackpot. And remember, the thinking mode is really just predictive text, so we can largely ignore most of that. What I'm looking for really is links to the articles. It's got 2 sources. Both of them just generically point to this journal here. So I do need a second prompt to say, can I get the links for all of the articles that you found? One really frustrating thing I'm finding with most of these AI search platforms is that it can be really hard to get them to just do a search sometimes. But on the second attempt, it does get all of the links for me. And if I click those, I can see that they do actually exist. They're not hallucinated links. So a bit of a tick for that task there, although it took me a couple of prompts. Probably should have been a little bit more straightforward, but it's found some pretty decent articles nonetheless. So these models have a lot of features. One thing that they are much better at now than 12 or 18 months ago is their mathematical reasoning. So for the second test, I'm going to open up this VC Specialist Mathematics exam. This is the 2025 paper for students studying specialist maths in Victoria. 17, 18-year-old students studying the highest level of secondary school maths. And I'm just popping in here, can you help me with this problem? Again, it's going into the thinking mode because I've got that Gemini 3 Pro model selected, and it quickly starts to outline and work its way through the problem. One thing that these models are much better at than, say, 12 or 18 months ago is actually stepping through mathematics problems, not just relying on the predictive text capabilities of a large language model and therefore giving us much more accurate answers. Once we've got an answer, we can then start to iterate through. So in the second prompt, I'm saying, can you provide a few exercises just to practice step 1? Now, this, in my experience, is one of the ways that math students are using these technologies quite regularly now. It's also something that I think a lot of the technology companies are actually tilting towards. If we think about platforms like Google Learn and other efforts from companies like OpenAI, they're definitely trying to turn these things into more of a so-called study buddy or a coach. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but increasingly for maths and sciences, these models are much better than they used to be. Now, in my experience, most of these leading models, so OpenAI's GPT-5 or 5.1 now, Claude's 4.5 Sonnet, and Gemini Google 3 can handle mathematics up to this level of top-end senior secondary maths. Last of all, I've asked it to build a little interactive to demonstrate some of the concepts. Now, it does hit an error, first of all, and you'll often find when coding that it hits some errors. We'll see more of this later on in this video. I'm going to click Fix Error and hope that it can actually troubleshoot and debug its own code. And just after a couple of attempts, based on that single question from the specialist mathematics paper, I do end up with a working interactive, which can be used to help visualize this particular maths problem. Now, I'm not a maths teacher. I'm an English teacher by trade. So if you are a maths teacher and you think this is incorrect or it's done something wrong or part of its logic or it's working out or maybe even the answer is incorrect, do put a comment on the video or on social media, wherever you found it, to let me know. And I'll make sure that when I write up the full article about this, we address those problems. But to me, it looks like it's done what I asked for. I asked it to create a visual interactive that can help me to understand the concept that I was working with in this particular instance. So again, most platforms, Claude, OpenAI, ChatGPT, and so on, can build these little interactives, but I do think Google Gemini has been quite good. Now, in this last little experiment here, before we get into the more complex, I've just provided it a bunch of links to future of work articles online. I gave it about 4 or 5 links, and very simply just said, using these links, create a small, simple website. And Gemini gives us the capability of producing these websites and then generating a shareable link. So based on 5 websites, Day of AI, IBM, OECD, World Economic Forum websites, it's produced this quite tidy looking little website here. It's got some careers advice. It's got a few statistics, a nice sort of smooth scrolling single page interface, information which it's pulled from those articles which I shared, and a few nice little features here around some of those statistics. It also added in a simple quiz, just 3 questions, which I think Google Gemini, in my experience, does tend to incorporate these little quizzes in there. So there must be something in its fine-tuning or its training which suggests to it that if it's producing a website for educational purposes, it should throw a little quiz in at the end. I'm not sure if that's particularly useful in every instance, but it works and it's a nice looking little website. Okay, so there are lots of different things that we can do with these applications. Deep research is a feature now of Google Gemini, Perplexity, OpenAI's ChatGPT has a deep research. Microsoft Copilot has one that it seems to be variously rolling out across different levels of accounts. And Claude also has a research mode. Google's deep research has always been pretty good. Obviously, it uses Google's search engine under the hood and does a decent job of producing fairly comprehensive reports. So I'm going to give it a pretty detailed prompt here to gather as much information about Australian tertiary courses in the creative industries as possible, focusing on the state where I'm based in Victoria, and saying that it can include universities, TAFEs, other institutions. And I've also added a caveat that I want places that are cognizant of some of the issues of generative AI in those creative industries. Now, it took about 15 to 18 minutes all up. So obviously I cut the actual process there in the middle. But by the end, we end up with this fairly comprehensive report. A lot of areas covered, links to university, TAFE, and private institutions' websites. A pretty good discussion all the way through of artificial intelligence in these industries, and lots of little case studies and things included throughout. Now, obviously, I want to still do my due diligence. I want to check those links manually, make sure that those links aren't hallucinated. But again, in my experience, Google Gemini's deep research is pretty good at providing accurate and actual existing links. So I would expect Google Gemini 3 to continue on in that fashion. One thing that's good about Google Gemini is that we can generate things like web pages, Google Docs, and so on directly from the research output. So if I bounce it into a Google Doc, I instantly get this nicely formatted document here. It's got a correct outline, makes it easy to navigate. There's a lot of information in there, but the references are all footnoted with the little numerical footnotes here. And at the end, we get a full reference list. So overall, pretty good at producing these kinds of reports. I did also click the button to generate a website. So much like I did earlier with those future career pathways websites, I can take a deep research report and actually turn that into a website, which creates generally a single page, smooth scrolling website with some simplified information from those research. So here's the Creative Futures Navigating Victorian Tertiary Education website that it's produced. Got a few filters in here, a couple of drop downs to select between things like private colleges, universities, and TAFEs. And just as an example of what these things can make, I will pop the link to this into the notes below the YouTube video. But overall, it's done a pretty good job here. Okay, now I'm moving over to Google AI Studio. Again, I'm using my paid account here. Google AI Studio is really more for developers and people experimenting rather than your day-to-day general use. But we'll take a look at it to see if we can do some slightly more advanced coding with it. Now in this example, down at the bottom of the screen there in the chat, you can see I'm asking for a polyhedral dice simulator, and I want it to have impressive visuals and the ability to select multiple dice of the same type or of a bit of a mix. I wanted to make sure that the rolls are actually random, and I want to add some options for colors, themes, and maybe a few other features of its own design. So this is a pretty complex task. Okay, I've tried this in numerous platforms. They're not great at developing the visuals. This is what Google comes up with on the first attempt. Okay, see I've got some bouncy dice, but they don't have any numbers on them. They are sort of vaguely polyhedral in shape. So not a bad first attempt, but certainly nothing usable. I wouldn't expect to get this absolutely right on the first attempt, but I can take screenshots, drop them in there, and then try to go backwards and forwards a little bit and iterate a few versions to try to get to what I want. Now in the first little error correction here, I've said the dice aren't showing any numbers. So we'll see how far we can get. And then I'm just going to speed up the video because frankly, I went backwards and forwards for about 10 or 15 minutes here trying to get it to do exactly what I wanted. This is a complex task. Generally rendering these kinds of visuals just within a single page of HTML code is quite difficult. So you can see I'm flinging backwards and forwards through lots of different iterations. And eventually I end up with a final version, which it's nearly correct. It's not quite all the way there, but it's doing a reasonably decent job. The physics on the dice rolls is not bad, given that it's just a single page of HTML code. You can see my different sided dice have numbers on them. The 6-sided dice has unfortunately got 2 numbers on the same side, and you'll see in a moment the 12-sided dice has 3 numbers per face, so that's not much good. But the rest of the dice actually are correct and they do work. So eventually we got sort of most of the way there. I've got a few different themed dice, different colors, and on this last attempt I rolled a natural 20 on the D20. So that's probably a good enough place to end that little experiment. Now that's a better job than any of the other platforms that I've tested with that same problem, ChatGPT, Claude, and so on. And then last of all, back in Google Gemini, just the regular gemini.google.com version, something a little bit more complex, I've asked it to create a science fiction world building simulator. Now, I also asked it to incorporate the Gemini chatbot and the Nano Banana image generator. And on my first attempt, it didn't seem to realize that it could actually do that without using an API key. Within Google Gemini, if you're using the canvas mode, which I've spoken about in other articles on my blog previously, the Gemini coding facility should allow it to incorporate Gemini chatbots, image generation, and all of these things without needing an API or any external access. So I got something sort of halfway there with the first prompt. In the second prompt, I've said, build it again, call the image gen, call the Gemini chatbot, and remember that in this canvas environment, you don't actually need to use an API key. And again, one of the frustrating and slightly weird things about many of these generative AI platforms is they really often they just don't understand what they're capable of. They'll frequently tell you that they can't do things that they can, or that they can do things that they can't. So I did end up with a working simulator for some science fiction world building. I've got some sliders which allow me to change surface, gravity, atmosphere, temperature. And if I hit this button here that says run full simulation, you can see that I do have now the image generation incorporated. It takes a little while, but it will generate a visualization. You can probably just about see at the bottom of the screen there the prompt that it uses, and it creates an image of the world based on those little sliders. We've also got a built-in chatbot, which it frames as a science officer that I can chat backwards and forwards to, and it gives me a sort of chatbot style response. And last of all, we've got these archives down here where it's created some information. So all in all, pretty impressive, well worth checking out Google Gemini 3. Thanks.